Night in Chicago, the winter wind slicing through the bones of a deserted alley littered with rusted cans and forgotten bottles. Under the jaundiced glow of a single flickering streetlight, a teenage couple stands locked in a desperate argument, breaths coming out in frantic, steaming puffs. The young woman, cheeks streaked with silent tears, clutches a newborn boy, swaddled hastily in a thin, faded blanket. Her eyes, wide and red, search the young man's face for a hint of resolve, of softness, but find only panic. His words cut sharper than the cold. "We can't do this. He'll ruin everything." Each syllable shakes in the frozen air, as though he's trying to convince himself more than her. Her arms tighten instinctively around the child, but fear and exhaustion drag her resolve to the breaking point. In a moment suspended between guilt and terror, they lower the baby beside a dented dustbin, the blanket barely enough against the biting wind. Their footsteps fade into the darkness as they flee, hearts pounding louder than the baby's slowing breaths. The camera lingers on the infant's face, pale and still except for a faint, fragile exhale misting in the cold night air. Somewhere nearby, a sanitation worker, shoulders slumped from a double shift, trudges down the alley pushing a squeaking metal cart. His boot crunches glass. He pauses, brow furrowed, catching the thinnest wisp of a cry, more like a whimper, nearly swallowed by the wind. Eyes wide, he bends down, hands trembling as he lifts the tiny bundle, his own breath catching at the sight of frost already biting the newborn's lips. Without a word, urgency propels him through the empty streets toward the nearest hospital, the baby's faint heartbeat spurring him faster than exhaustion can slow. Inside the emergency ward, fluorescent lights buzz overhead as doctors and nurses surround the small body, working frantically, their voices clipped and urgent. The worker stands by, grime still smudging his uniform, watching helplessly, heart pounding with fear and something he can't quite name. A raw, protective ache for a child he doesn't know. His hand quivers as he signs the incident report, each letter shaky and uneven, not realizing this single act will alter the course of the boy's life forever. Above it all, a quiet, almost resigned voice rises, cutting through the sterile hum of the hospital. They didn't want me, but life had other plans. At 24, Nate lives in a cramped Chicago apartment, whose thin walls barely muffle the hum of the city beyond. The space smells faintly of burnt coffee and overheated circuits, cluttered with half-assembled prototypes, empty takeout boxes, and whiteboards scrawled with pivot strategies and financial projections. By day, he hustles from pitch meetings in borrowed suits that never quite fit, trying to sell a vision of financial inclusion to skeptical investors. By night, he sits hunched over a flickering laptop, coding and recalculating until dawn breaks through the blinds. His startup, a fintech platform built to help underserved communities access small, fair loans, is more than a business. It's the fragile spine holding together years of pain, grit, and desperate hope. The memories that shape Nate come in flashes he never invites, but can't quite shut out. As a child, he moved through foster homes like passing stations in the dark, some cold and neglectful, where food was rationed like kindness. Others gentler, where well-meaning strangers read bedtime stories and tucked him in, though he always left before the last page could turn. At 9, he stayed briefly with the Walkers, a middle-aged couple who smelled of lavender and old books. They taught him to tie a tie, taught him the difference between discipline and cruelty, and for a fleeting season, he believed he might finally belong. But even love couldn't stretch their strained finances, and when the call came from the agency, goodbye was quiet and heavy, with things left unsaid. After that, hope became something Nate rationed carefully, like matches in a storm. As a teenager, he drifted between overcrowded shelters and church basements, learning to hide exhaustion behind quiet defiance. He scrubbed dishes in diners until his fingers cracked, unloaded trucks overnight in warehouses, and still somehow found time to sneak into public libraries. There, hunched over aging computers, he discovered a different kind of belonging, in lines of code that obeyed him when the world would not. He built rudimentary apps and scrappy prototypes, self-taught in JavaScript and stubborn determination. Every small success a rebellion against the narrative written for kids like him. Now, driven by wounds invisible to most, Nate stands on the edge of a fragile dream. He never knew who his parents were. All he's ever had is the story whispered around social workers and case files. Found beside garbage. The words live under his skin like an old burn, pushing him to prove, to create, to outrun the fear that maybe that's all he was ever meant to be. Friends occasionally text late at night, asking if he's okay. Most messages go unread until dawn. His mentor, Marcus, a grizzled 45-year-old who once played the VC game before founding a non-profit for at-risk youth, leans against the doorframe of Nate's co-working space one evening, his voice rough with concern. "You're building something great," Marcus says, gaze steady. "But what about building yourself?" Nate forces a crooked smile, brushing it aside with practiced ease, though Marcus's words echo later in the silence. But Nate can't afford to slow down. The startup's runway is measured in weeks. If he doesn't secure new funding soon, the servers will go dark, the team will scatter, and the mission that gave his suffering meaning will vanish. He's poured years of survival into lines of code and pitch decks, built something that could help kids like the boy he once was, kids without family, safety nets, or even a name untainted by abandonment. And so, each morning, he tightens the knot in his tie, sharpens his slide deck, and forces his shaking hands to still. Because if this collapses, it won't just be a business failing. It will be the final confirmation of what that winter night in an alley tried to tell him, that some lives are meant to be thrown away. And Nate, haunted yet hopeful, refuses to accept that. At a sleek downtown Chicago hotel, all marble floors and curated minimalism, Nate finds himself under harsh spotlight glare, clutching a worn pitch deck as he delivers his rehearsed vision to a sea of skeptical investors. His voice trembles only slightly when he talks about financial empowerment for the underserved, about breaking cycles of exclusion. But inside, pressure coils tight around his ribs, each breath a reminder of what's at stake. Afterward, as the crowd disperses into polite applause and networking small talk, a woman in her early 40s catches his eye. Impeccably dressed, posture polished by years of boardrooms and media appearances, Victoria Reed isn't someone Nate recognizes. Yet something in the way she stares at him feels oddly personal, almost wounded. They speak briefly by the coffee stand, her questions oddly hesitant. How old is he? Where did he grow up? And when he answers, her manicured fingers tremble just enough to spill a splash of espresso onto the white tablecloth. Would you mind meeting privately? She asks, voice tight as if forcing control over something fragile. Curiosity, mixed with the faint hope of funding, compels Nate to agree. In a quiet meeting room upstairs, the city's glittering skyline framed behind them, Victoria's poise begins to crack. Her eyes, sharp and professional moments ago, now look haunted. Words catch in her throat, until finally, almost in a whisper, she asks, "Were you adopted?" The question slices through Nate's defenses, and for a moment, all he can do is blink, confusion mixing with a defensive anger he can't explain. "I wasn't adopted," he replies flatly. "I was found, abandoned as a baby." The words hang in the sterile air, and something inside Victoria visibly breaks. Shoulders sagging, voice cracking under decades of shame, she confesses. She is his biological mother. That freezing night, barely more than a terrified girl herself, she made what she thought was the only choice. The guilt of it has haunted every breath since. Nate feels the ground lurch under him, stomach twisting violently as her words sink in. Blood roars in his ears, drowning out the rest. The woman who left him beside garbage, the faceless figure in his nightmares, now sits across from him, wealthy, respected, seeking not just forgiveness, but some impossible bridge back into his life. Shock quickly turns to fury, betrayal surging hot through veins that, it turns out, carry her blood. Years of fighting for scraps, of sleepless nights in shelters and coding on borrowed time, of building an identity around survival. All upended by the revelation that the person who discarded him now watches him with tearful regret. "You don't get to do this," he spits out, voice shaking with a rage deeper than words. Victoria pleads, her words tumbling over each other. Explanations, regrets, the impossible wish to go back. But Nate can barely see her through the blur of anger and raw hurt. His pulse pounding so loudly it almost drowns out her sobs. Nate storms out into the night, the cold air biting his face. On the crowded sidewalk, surrounded by strangers, he feels more alone than he ever has, because the one truth he built his life on, that he was unwanted by people he never knew, has twisted into something far more painful. The mother he spent his life trying not to think about is real, alive, and suddenly unbearably close. And whether he wants to or not, this meeting forces him to face the past he thought he'd buried forever, threatening to unravel everything he's built to protect himself. Nate throws himself back into work, clutching his routine like a lifeline. But the encounter with Victoria gnaws at the edges of every thought. Lines of code blur into flashes of memory. Cold nights in crowded shelters, the quiet kindness of the walkers, the hollow echo of caseworkers' voices calling him a ward of the state. Sleep turns restless, haunted by a woman's tear-streaked face, whispering confessions he never wanted to hear. Each morning he forces himself out of bed, eyes gritty, jaw clenched, pushing past exhaustion to pitch decks and strategy calls. But beneath the professional armor, anger churns with something far more dangerous, a raw, unspoken longing to understand why. Victoria doesn't disappear. At first, it's letters slipped under his apartment door, the handwriting careful and hesitant. Then voicemails, her voice cracking as she admits that she and Daniel were privileged, reckless teens, paralyzed by fear and family pressure. Their parents saw Nate not as a child, but as a stain threatening future careers and family reputations. "We were told to get rid of the mistake," she says, each word laced with guilt so heavy it seems to warp the air. The truth hits Nate like a second abandonment, confirmation that his life was decided by boardroom whispers and legacy anxiety. Worse still, Daniel, now a towering figure in Chicago real estate, doesn't even know Nate survived that freezing night. As these revelations seep into his days, Nate's startup begins to buckle under mounting pressure. A critical investor, catching wind of Nate's emotional volatility, withdraws a promised round, throwing their financial projections into chaos. His co-founder, Grace, a pragmatic idealist whose calm steadied Nate more times than he'll admit, corners him one night in their cramped office. "You keep saying you built this to escape the past," she challenges, eyes locked on his. "But maybe you built it to prove something to them." The words land like a slap, painful because they ring true. For years, Nate believed he'd been forging his own destiny, but deep down, had every pitch and prototype been a plea for acknowledgement from ghosts he never met? Unable to quiet the questions, Nate does what he's always done. He searches for answers himself. Late at night, illuminated by the cold glow of his monitor, he dives into Daniel's world. Annual reports, newspaper clippings, whispers in industry forums. He finds smiling press photos of a man who looks chillingly familiar. The same eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. But beneath the polished image, Nate uncovers a darker narrative. Daniel's empire was cemented through ethically dubious deals, aggressive acquisitions that displaced low-income tenants, razed historic neighborhoods, and left families scrambling for shelter. Many of those evictions, Nate realizes, targeted communities painfully similar to the ones that once took him in. Rage tightens around his chest, not just for himself, but for all the invisible lives crushed beneath Daniel's climb to power. Spurred by anger and a sense of duty he barely understands, Nate decides to confront Daniel, not to heal, not to bond, but to force the man to see the consequences of choices made decades ago. To stand in front of the father who discarded him and demand he look his own son in the eye. Meanwhile, Victoria continues to reach out, her persistence a mix of desperation and fragile hope. After days of silence, Nate agrees to see her again, though the decision feels less like forgiveness and more like an obligation to his own unfinished story. They meet in a quiet cafe on the city's edge, far from Daniel's glittering skyline. Victoria arrives early, hands trembling around a chipped coffee cup, her once impeccable mask stripped away by weeks of raw honesty. Nate listens without softening, the anger in his chest pulsing alongside an ache he hates to name. She speaks of guilt so corrosive it shaped her entire life. Charity boards she joined trying to give back. Nights spent staring at a hospital bracelet she kept all these years. When she pauses, waiting for a word of comfort, Nate's voice cuts through the silence. "I'm not here to forgive you. I just need the truth." And truth she gives him. How she wept outside the hospital, too ashamed to walk in. How Daniel never knew she kept the pregnancy hidden until it was too late. How every success afterward tasted of ashes. Nate absorbs it, feeling his rage clash against an empathy he doesn't want to feel. But when she finishes, he doesn't offer absolution. Just a curt nod. The first small sign that maybe beneath the wreckage, he's ready to face what was left behind. Back at the office, Grace finds him staring at the city through rain-streaked glass. "What now?" she asks softly. Nate's answer is quiet but steady, the anger in his voice edged with resolve. "Now, I make sure he sees me, not for who he wanted me to be, but for what he helped create." Because buried under the pain, Nate understands that confronting Daniel isn't just about vengeance, it's about reclaiming the power of his own story and making sure it can't be ignored again. The grand ballroom glitters with chandeliers and soft music, the air perfumed with money and carefully rehearsed goodwill as Chicago's elite gather under the banner, investing in tomorrow's children. Nate slips in wearing his one good suit, heart pounding so hard it feels like it might crack through his ribs. Across the room, Daniel holds court effortlessly, his silvered hair and tailored tuxedo projecting benevolence and power. A man revered for reshaping city skylines. Nate watches the practiced smile, the way heads tilt toward Daniel's every word, and for a heartbeat, the years spent in shadows flare into fury. When their eyes finally meet, Daniel's polite curiosity morphs into wary confusion, then tightens into defensiveness as Nate introduces himself plainly. "I'm Nathaniel," letting the name hang heavy between them. Daniel laughs it off at first, but the laugh dies when he really looks. At the familiar eyes, the bone structure that mirrors his own. The colour drains from Daniel's face as realization claws through disbelief. But what blooms isn't remorse. It's raw, calculating fear. Nate sees it clearly. Daniel isn't struck by the weight of a lost son, but by the risk, the threat to the empire built on spotless legacy and ruthless ambition. Words between them sharpen, cold and clipped, Nate demands acknowledgement. Daniel tries to pivot, to control the narrative. The music and polite laughter swirl around them, but the confrontation hums like a live wire. Daniel's final defense is chillingly simple. I built everything I have by leaving the past buried. Nate's voice cracks, but only for a moment before steel sets in. Then maybe it's time to dig it up. Days earlier, Nate had prepared a dossier of Daniel's most ruthless deals: forced evictions, forged signatures, and entire neighborhoods cleared to make way for gleaming towers. Now, as the gala speeches drone on, Nate anonymously sends the files to investigative journalists waiting outside, their cameras ready to catch the first ripple of scandal. Within hours, the press descends. Whispers sharpen into headlines, and Daniel's mask begins to crumble under public scrutiny. Almost at the same time, Nate's startup, once on the brink, surges back into the spotlight. The scandal ironically amplifies the company's mission to protect vulnerable communities from exactly the kind of predatory practices Daniel perfected. A new feature Nate's team had quietly piloted goes viral, praised as a tool to help tenants understand and fight unjust evictions. For the first time, Nate sees his story, the pain and survival that once felt like chains, turned into real, tangible power. But the real twist comes quietly, away from flashing cameras and breaking news. Victoria finds Nate alone on a windswept balcony, her expression stripped of the guarded polish she wore before. Her confession spills out, halting yet painfully honest. All those years she stayed silent, she couldn't stay away entirely. It was her anonymous donations that funded a scholarship Nate used at 18. Her quiet gifts that kept a shelter open the winter Nate had nowhere else to go. "I know it wasn't enough," she says, voice breaking. "I couldn't undo leaving you there, but I never stopped regretting it." The words dig under Nate's scars, not healing them, but forcing him to see the truth in all its messy human complexity. She'd been complicit in his abandonment, but not completely absent from his survival. Nate stands there, shoulders rigid, the city glittering behind him like a promise and a warning. The rage that drove him to this moment still simmers, but it's tangled now with something he can't name. Grief for what might have been, and reluctant recognition of what small, hidden good did come. His voice shakes when he finally answers, "You can't fix what you broke." Victoria nods, tears streaking her makeup. "I know, but I had to tell you. I tried." In that fragile moment, Nate understands that reckoning isn't the same as reconciliation. Some wounds remain, but the power to define what comes next, that belongs to him now. In the weeks that follow the gala, Nate watches Daniel's carefully curated empire fracture under the weight of truth, while Victoria retreats from public life, her tearful confessions lingering in Nate's mind like echoes in a long corridor. Yet instead of stepping into either world, Daniel's ruthless power built on other people's suffering, or Victoria's wealth haunted by the ghosts of past mistakes, Nate chooses a third path, one carved by scars turned into strength. With Grace by his side, no longer just a co-founder but a partner in every sense, he refocuses the startup from survival mode to a mission-driven force, building financial literacy programs, affordable microloans, and real tools that help kids like the one he once was see possibility instead of walls. The platform, once an act of defiance, becomes something greater, a hand reaching back to pull others forward. Grace keeps him grounded, gently reminding him during late-night strategy sessions and coffee-fueled code sprints that he's more than an origin story whispered in social worker files. Slowly, the narrative Nate carried in silence, that he was discarded, worthless, destined to remain a ghost, fades into something new, a story of choice, agency, and purpose. Meanwhile, Victoria, in a final act of quiet atonement, donates half her fortune to children's charities and shelters. Nate doesn't attend the press conference. He sends no thank you. But privately, he acknowledges it. Not as absolution, but as a recognition that some debts, while never repaid, can still inspire something good. One grey morning, Nate walks back to the alley where it all began. The dumpsters are still there, graffiti older and darker, the wind biting the same as it did 24 years ago. But this time, he doesn't see it as the place his life was discarded. He sees it as the place it started. He stands taller than the shadows, his breath steady, and in that quiet moment, he lets the past settle behind him. Not forgotten, but no longer his master. Turning away, Nate carries with him not just memory and pain, but proof that identity isn't handed down by blood or betrayal. It's built, moment by moment, choice by choice, into something unshakably his own. Night settles softly over the city, the skyline glowing with possibility rather than threat. On the rooftop of his company's new headquarters, a space once only a sketch on a discarded napkin, Nate stands alone, hands in his pockets, wind tugging gently at his coat. Below, lights trace the streets he once walked hungry and unseen. Now they shine back at him like quiet acknowledgement. For a moment, the noise of success, pressure, and memory fades, leaving only the steady beat of his heart and the weight of what it all means. His gaze sweeps across towers of glass and steel, past landmarks that once felt unreachable. Voice calm but edged with hard-won truth, he reflects. They threw me away thinking I'd never matter, but sometimes what they discard becomes priceless, not for wealth, but for what it survives to build. In his hand, a small plaque catches the city's glow. He bends to fasten it to the rooftop wall, the words etched in simple letters. For those society leaves behind, may you build what they can't imagine. The plaque isn't grand or gold-plated, but its quiet presence feels heavier than any trophy or headline. The camera lingers as Nate straightens, shoulders no longer bowed by anger or shame. The boy left in an alley has become the man standing above it all, not untouched by pain, but defined by what he forged from it. Fade out on his silhouette against the restless city, no longer the abandoned child, but a man who turned rejection into resolve, and in doing so, lit a path for countless others to follow. Building financial literacy programs, affordable microloans, and real tools that help kids like the one he once was see possibility instead of walls. The platform, once an act of defiance, becomes something greater, a hand reaching back to pull others forward.